In this lecture, I plan to open a set of 3 lectures that deal with essentially how Alexander planned to run his world empire. In the last lecture, we ended with Alexander and the army reunited in Persia, probably in November of 325 BC. The various elements were now in the former Persian heartland. Nearchus had brought the fleet safely from the Indus Valley. And there are 2 points we have to keep in mind for the next 3 lectures, and that is, first, Alexander's position had changed considerably since he crossed the Tigris River back in 330 BC and undertook the conquest of the eastern half of the Persian Empire. In 324 BC, he had been away from these areas, the Persian capitals of Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, Persepolis, which had been burned by Alexander, for almost 6 years. Alexander had not been back to Macedon in nearly 10 years. So in 324 BC, January of 324 BC, when Alexander begins to reorder the administration of the empire, it's been some 6 to 10 years since he'd been in these regions. And there were a number of changes that were necessary to make, and a number of the satraps, Greek financial secretaries, the Persian nobility, who had been co-opted into a service, they all had to be disciplined. Some were punished and replaced. The second important point that I stress is that by 325 BC, beginning of 324 BC, Alexander had essentially 4 major roles to play, and I've referred to this point several times before, particularly in connection with the criticism of Alexander in the period of 330 to 327 BC. When he returned from India in late 325 BC, Alexander had essentially 4 jobs to play. These jobs all represented different positions he held for this vast empire, which really wasn't a single organic state as we understood it. First and foremost, he was still king of Macedon, and we'll be discussing in one lecture that very important role he played. The Macedonians were the base of his power. This is how he had been reared, and in many ways, Alexander always remained a king of the Macedonians and very much the son of Philip, whatever the claims to divinity were. The second role he played was as Pharaoh of Egypt. That was very easy and congenial. As a young conqueror, he had been hailed in Egypt as Pharaoh and God. He had won the position of Great King of Persia, or Great King of the East, or Lord of Asia. Any of these titles would describe the way Alexander was viewed by his various Asian subjects, notably the Iranians, but also the Rajas in India, as well as the peoples of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Asia Minor. Finally, there was that 4th role, and that will be essentially a lecture in itself, and that is as commander of the Hellenic League. He was still strategos autokrator, supreme commander of the Greek League. The war against the Persians, as a war of revenge, as a pan-Hellenic war, had ended in early 330 BC, when Alexander had dismissed his Greek allies. Now, many of those allies had signed on as mercenaries, but henceforth he campaigned in the last 6 years essentially as the Great King and the Macedonian King. Those would be the 2 roles he principally played in the last 6 years in the great Eastern campaigns in Iran, Central Asia, and India. So in late 325 BC, Alexander faced some very, very daunting problems. One was to order the administration, which was really not running very effectively because of his long absence. And the second was how to reconcile, or at least how to juggle, perhaps is a better word, these 4 roles. And that leads to the topics of the coming lectures. One of the issues I want to deal with will be the whole question of deification and divinity, how that figured in as a way of securing the succession and Alexander's position in this new world empire. Another is dealing with the Macedonians and how they would fit in the new world empire. And finally concluding with the Greeks of the Corinthian League, that is the Hellenic League. And in that area, Alexander in some ways faced his greatest dilemma. Well, very quickly, Alexander judged those satraps, garrison commanders, and secretaries who had not followed his orders. Alexander insisted on taxes being paid and the routes of reinforcements being secured, but he also insisted on justice and proper administration of his satrapies. A number of satraps were cashiered. This included several leading Persians, some of them implicated in a revolt or a would-be revolt in 324 BC. Among the commanders, many of them were dismissed. Many of the commanders who had been left in the western and central areas of the Persian Empire had hired large numbers of mercenaries, personal armies. There had been instances of extortion. The most notorious, the man who headed the list in this, was the chief treasurer, Harpalos, who was a boyhood friend of Alexander. Harpalos' brother Philip is actually the first satrap in India, and he had an enormous sum of money at Babylon, and he absconded with reputedly 6,000 talents and 5,000 mercenaries, and eventually made his way to Athens, and that contributed to problems in dealing with the Athenians. While Alexander had been absent in the East for over 6 years, Harpalos had played virtually the role of king in Babylon, selling favors, justice, everything else. He had a notorious mistress, Pythonice, who was virtually the queen she was a courtesan, who was essentially enthroned in Babylon. And there was really any kind of decadence you could think of had been celebrated there, and Harpalos ends up being a rather notorious figure, and even the Athenians are unclear what to do with this guy. He has a lot of money and mercenaries. That could be good in a revolt against Alex, but otherwise the Athenians were very wary of this guy. The administration was very, very quickly brought to heel. Alexander appointed Hephaestion as his heliarch, which is a Greek term that translates a Persian term that essentially means chief vizier, chief administrator of the entire empire. And in 325, late 325 and 324 BC, there was a significant reordering, at least of the personnel at the top levels. There were several problems that had to be addressed in the wider context of administering this world empire. As I've discussed, that much of the administration and taxation had been inexpedient. It was essentially to sustain the various wars of conquest that had now drawn to a definitive close in 325. In late 325 BC. Yes, there was an expedition being prepared against Arabia. There were thoughts of an expedition to India, even to the Western Med. But these were new ventures. The empire, the known world, had been conquered. Alexander trusted Hephaestion, who had very, very important administrative skills and had displayed them throughout the later stages of the campaign. Now, one of the most perplexing issues that comes to light with Alexander's return is the question of divine honors and deification. There is a great deal of discussion on this topic, bearing on Alexander's own sense of destiny. What did he mean by this? Why did he adopt it? But there's also a wider political context and wider political ramifications, which ancient authors really understood much better than most of us moderns. The veneration of royal figures in the Greco-Macedonian and Roman worlds, and the hope that these monarchs might achieve divine status, was perceived in many ways as also a political solution. Think about it for a moment. One of Alexander's most difficult tasks is to reconcile all these Greek allies to the fact that he was king of Macedon and now lord of essentially the known world. That in his own mind, he had come to believe that he is somehow a son of Zeus in the extended sense of the word, that his destiny will lead him to Olympus, that he had emulated his ancestors, Heracles, Perseus, and Achilles, and had exceeded their deeds many times over. Alexander had this personal side that this personal commitment to this sense of divinity, but there was also a pragmatic element. And one of the aspects about Alexander, I think, that is so perplexing and so difficult for us to come to terms with, is that in the Greek world, in the wider Greek world, including the Macedonians, that there was always a pragmatic and pious action together in any kind of sphere of political life. All political acts were sanctified by sacrifices. Any kind of major decision had generally religious implications. We saw that at the Hephaestus when the mutiny broke out, or the strike, more likely, is a better word. And essentially, Alexander offered sacrifices to the gods as a way of affirming the decision to return home. The same was true at the Indus, where sacrifices were held. And throughout the expedition, there's constant religious actions going on. Now, Alexander could present himself to his Greek allies as a veritable divine figure, and that had certain pragmatic and practical political applications. For one, it took him outside the realm of the polis. in a very strange way. Greek political life centered on the city-state, on the polis, in which all citizens agreed to rule by laws passed by the assembly, that is, the body of citizens, and obeyed by all members of the assembly. And this form of self-governance led to eunomia, that is, a well-ordered state, and distinguished Greeks from barbarians. Alexander was in a peculiar position vis-a-vis his Hellenic allies. In many ways, he was a Greek. At least his mother's side was Greek. His mother was recognized as a Greek. So half of Alexander's ancestry is definitely Greek on that score alone. The Argead kings had been extended Hellenic identity more as a courtesy probably than descent. In his aesthetics, in his language, in many of his aspects of religious beliefs, he was very much home with the Greek world. But he was also a Macedonian king. And the only way a king could be accepted in the Greek world would be, well, he would be a tyrant. He would be outside the law. A king, by definition, was a negation of the polis. But a great figure like Alexander, who had divine qualities and was likely heading for Olympus anyway, well, he stood outside the limits of the polis. He could stand outside as benefactor, as commander of the armies. He could also, in the later Hellenistic age, his successors would take titles such as Epiphanes, one who appears, or Euergetes, a benefactor, and in some ways, Alexander could posture as a founder. Katesis is the word in Greek. That would be the individual who established a polis. We have many such founders in Greek colonies, and founders were usually given special rights after their death. There would be a tomb to the founder, and the founder would be venerated as, in a sense, the ancestor of all the citizens. So, as Alexander came to embrace this notion of his divine destiny, there was, along with it, a very, very powerful practical side. Arrian and Plutarch understand this. So does Curtius Rufus. All of these men are writing in the Roman Empire, and they are very familiar with similar types of ruler practices among the Roman emperors. And these all ultimately go back to Alexander's own example. Alexander essentially sets this notion of a ruler cult or a veneration of the ruler. Finally, Greek religious practices never made a very, very strong division between the divine and the human. The boundaries were constantly crossed in the myths and legends, and there are various precedents in early Greek history, at least to the Greeks, that mortal figures made their way to Olympus, usually because of great deeds, or once in a while sometimes because Zeus needs a cupbearer like Ganymede, or whisks up some sweet young thing to entertain him at Olympus. But fundamentally, it would be great deeds in the lifetime that would lead mortals to join the immortals. Many scholars have doubted that Alexander was moving towards the request or the inclination of accepting divine honors, because no decree has come down in the sources. We do not have an inscription. We do not have a report of an official decree in the literary sources, or at least in the main accounts, Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus. And so the result is that this issue has sometimes been set aside as really kind of tangential. On the other hand, we do have information, first precedents, and a mounting number of precedents, that by Alexander's day, the notion that a great mortal could achieve divine honors and ultimately deification, apotheosis, to use the Greek word, was pretty widely understood and accepted, at least in some quarters. The second is we do have certain anecdotal material and other evidence to suggest that Alexander, while he may not have issued an edict, sometime in 324 BC, made it known to his friends in the Greek world that he would be more than willing to accept divine honors voted by the various city-states of Greece. And we have anecdotes that these were actually voted in both Athens and at Sparta. The sources are late. They're not necessarily the best sources. Nonetheless, these sources tell us that there was some kind of voting of honors. The most delightful of the reports of the Spartans, ever reticent and laconic in their speech. One comes from the Roman writer Aelian, and he writes as follows. Alexander, when he conquered Darius and took possession of the Persian Empire, was prideful of himself and publicly displayed himself on account of his then illustrious good fortune. He sent envoys to the Greeks. Now, Aelian may be overstating the case. He's writing in the 2nd century AD, that they vote him to be a god. With laughter in any case, for he did not so much hold these honors from his own nature, but rather he, by asking for these honors from men, enjoyed them. Various Greeks, therefore, voted different honors, but the Spartans voted the following: since Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be a god. Simultaneously, in their laconic manner and according to their native custom, they spoke, reproaching the foolishness of Alexander. Plutarch has a similar paraphrase. He claims that the Spartans voted, and, quote, "We concede to Alexander that, if he so wishes, he may be called a god." There are similar anecdotal comments from Athens about the Athenians as well. And there are good precedents for this. Lysander, the Navarch who won the Peloponnesian War for the Spartans, we know from his biography by Plutarch and other accounts that the grateful oligarchs, that is, the political exiles restored to power at various cities, venerated Lysander with honors that were clearly divine. There was a festival instituted for him, known as the Festival of Lysander, at the city of Samos, and that was conducted for at least 2 generations after his death. There are 2 tyrants, one Dion, the Syracusan tyrant, and the other a rather obscure tyrant from Asia Minor. Both of them had proclaimed themselves divine in the mid-4th century BC. Perhaps one of the most telling pieces of evidence that has only come to light very recently from a papyrus fragment is a poem of Simonides, and we knew that this lyric poet of the late 6th, early 5th century BC had written a number of celebratory poems. A poem that was written 2 years after the Battle of Plataea, that is in 477 BC. This is the great battle that ended the Persian threat to Greece. And in that poem, the various citizens from the allied Greek city-states that fell in the battle are venerated and exalted as heroes and as worthy of joining the company of the gods. This poem was something of a revelation. It confirmed lots of other information that under certain circumstances, that a very, very extraordinary mortal who displayed the fortune, the favor of the gods. In the term of Herodotus, this would be someone olbius, that is blessed. The Latin equivalent would be beatus. It is not just someone who is lucky, and that would in Greek would be eutukes, but someone who enjoyed a special favor, a special communication with the gods, could be then elevated into their company. And so the best guess is that sometime in early 324 BC, while Alexander is grieving over the death of his dear friend Hephaestion, who was voted not divine honors but heroic honors by the oracle at Siwa eventually, that Alexander let it be known that divine honors would more or less be acceptable to him, and his many friends on the Synedrion at Corinth. These would be Greek representatives of the city-states, particularly the lesser city-states that probably liked Macedonian overlordship because it kept cities like Athens, Sparta, and Thebes off their back, were willing to vote various types of divine and heroic honors, and that led to the various anecdotal accounts we have from Plutarch and Aelian and other late sources. This was a stunning decision on the part of Alexander. It was a momentous decision. It sets in motion a tradition of veneration of the ruler that becomes characteristic of the monarchies of the Hellenistic age and eventually feeds into what we often call emperor worship in the Roman imperial age. The practical side of this is quite evident in a number of ways. First, by standing outside of the polis as a divine figure, Alexander was not a tyrant. He could be venerated as an exceptional benefactor, as a special figure. He could tolerate the existence of different types of oligarchic or democratic constitutions that were outside of his direct control, and yet at the same time, his various supporters in the Greek city-state would have his will affected. And that was a very, very important advantage, because playing that role of supreme commander of the League of Corinth was a very difficult role to play. By inclination, Alexander was a monarch, and when you're dealing with Greeks, you have to persuade. You can't order them. And so this peculiar form of veneration of the ruler as a potential god becomes a way out of reconciling the city-state, the Greek city-state, the polis, with the notion of a wider monarchy. And this was perhaps one of the greatest legacies, political legacies, that came out of Alexander's conquests and career. It allowed the Greek city-state to continue as the defining institution in this emerging Hellenic or Hellenistic world. We often call it Hellenistic Greek-like world. We'll be discussing the role and importance of cities in later lectures, but it allowed these city-states to assume this very important cultural and economic role, religious role, as the defining institution by which most people identified themselves, and exalt the city-state as the premier institution at the same time when these city-states ultimately were under the control of a monarch. To be sure, a Phil-Hellene Macedonian monarch, a monarch who was not a Persian king or a pharaoh of Egypt, a monarch who shared many of the same aesthetics and certainly language and traditions as the city-state, but a monarch nonetheless. And Arrian and Plutarch have no doubt about this, that this practical side of the ruler cult, that's what one of Alexander's main purposes was, to do this. It is clear that these notions of some type of divine destiny, even parentage of Zeus, for all of the jeers and mocking it evoked from some of the Macedonians, it was seen by Alexander's closest associates as also politically expedient. And in the years immediately after Alexander's death, all of Alexander's successors, the Diadochoi, or at least all of them who had aspirations to monarchy, they all pushed the notion of a cult of Alexander the Great, that Alexander on his death, either on the 10th or 11th of June in 323 BC, had joined the company of the gods. They all pushed this notion because then they in turn would be successors of a god. And that leads to a speculative point on my part and some other historians, is that not only was it advantageous for Alexander to present himself as a god or as a potential divine figure to his Greek cities and to the Greek cities and allies, but also it would reflect well on his heir. At this point, Alexander was attempting to establish a secure dynasty. We'll be discussing that in a coming lecture. He had a posthumous son, Alexander IV, to Roxanne, the Sogdian princess, born several months after his death. And if Alexander had lived longer and had a larger royal family, these notions of divinity or these notions that the royal house was linked to the gods of Olympus, this would all be to the advantage of his successor. This would all be a form of legitimacy in which almost all the subjects and allies of this vast empire could agree upon. And again, it would have political ramifications beyond Alexander's own lifetime. It just so happened that the successors were not members of his family, but his various generals and boyhood friends who eventually carved out empires of their own. And there's some very telling evidence as to how quickly these successors seized upon this notion. They didn't invent this. They're following Alexander on essentially promoting a cult of Alexander the Great. One of the most remarkable cases comes from my favorite successor, who will be coming up in the later lectures, and this is a man called Eumenes of Cardia. I've mentioned him in connection with the sources. He was Alexander's secretary. He came from the city of Cardia, which is in the Thracian Chersonesus, today the Gallipoli. So he was by birth a Greek, although he had entered Macedonian service and was regarded as essentially a Macedonian, a naturalized Macedonian by Alexander's day. He kept the day book, the Ephemerides, which is apparently one of the major sources consulted by Arrian. He turned out to be an extremely talented general, and he was also loyal to Alexander's house. In the wars of the successors between 323 and 316 BC, he's one of the few successors of Alexander who really had the interests of Alex and his family at heart. And that was in part because he was still despised as a Greek, that the Macedonian nobility, who were the senior generals, never really regarded Eumenes as one of them, and so Eumenes could never aspire to the type of command and position that the Macedonian nobles could. Nonetheless, we're told in probably sometime around 320, 319 BC, that Eumenes After the so-called Conference of Triparadisios we'll be talking about, Eumenes had gained control of a crack military unit in Asia Minor known as the Silver Shields. And these are the fellows who were once known as the Hypacipists. They're guarding an enormous treasure at a town in Cilicia, which is southwestern Turkey today. And he gains control of these forces, and they really are very reluctant to put themselves under the command of a Greek. There are two officers there, Antigenes and Teutomus, who essentially oppose Eumenes. And the way he gets around this is essentially by creating an Alexander cult on the spot. And this is what we're told by Plutarch, recording this in the life of Eumenes. Their envy, that is, the officers of the Silver Shields, Eumenes moderated by refusing to accept money as if he had not indeed needed it, and their ambition and emulation, who were neither able to govern nor willing to obey, he conquered by the help of superstition. For he told them, these are the officers of the Silver Shields, that Alexander had appeared to him, Eumenes, in a dream and showed him a regal pavilion richly furnished with a throne in it, and told him if they would sit in council there, he himself, that is Alexander, would be present, and prosper all the consultations and actions upon which they should enter in his name. And therefore, Eumenes sets up this royal tent with various paraphernalia of Alexander, and there's an argument to be made that many of those objects eventually ended up in the tomb of Vergina, Tomb 2, which was excavated in Macedon back in the 1970s. We also have coins issued by the successors, particularly one by Lysimachus, who was one of Alexander's bodyguards, a very important officer, who gained the satrapy of Thrace in 323 BC. And these coins issued shortly after 300 BC show Alexander with the horn, that is the horn of Zeus Ammon from the oracle at Siwa. And sometimes the portrait also shows Alexander sporting the diadem. Within years of Alexander's death, there were efforts to promote this notion that Alexander had indeed joined the gods. And so this leads us back to the position that Alexander was fully aware of not only his divine destiny, but also the practical application of these wishes for divine honors and how it could be used as a means of legitimacy for himself and his heirs, and as one of the few points upon which all of his various subjects and allies could agree upon. The ultimate heirs of this system would be the Roman emperors. Roman emperors, starting with Augustus, who founded the Roman Empire, carried out a similar type of circumspect ruler cult in which the Roman emperors, their spirit, in Latin known as the genius or the genius, we get the word genius from it, was venerated, and this had the potential of being divinized should the emperor prove a great and worthy ruler. If he did not, his memory could be condemned, and that would happen to such rulers as one would think of Caligula or Nero. But those emperors who did not were offered a formal act of consecration. They would join the company of the gods and would become divus, or divi in the plural, that is, deified ones, divine figures. And in many ways, what Alexander did was create the basis for the foundation of both the Hellenistic states that followed him, that is, the great Macedonian monarchies that carved up his empire, and then ultimately his institutional heirs, the Romans, the Roman emperors, who found a means of reconciling all of these different peoples by the veneration of a ruler, and so achieve the peace of a great world empire. And these efforts by Alexander are just the start of a long tradition and one of the unintended consequences of his career. And the Roman emperors understood this. In many ways, they look back to Alexander as their greatest forebear, the man who essentially set the mold for their own rule over the Mediterranean world.